Why does human logic utterly break down when we try to look at the creation of the universe? How can we trust our conclusions if the very tool we use to ponder this subject has a clear biological bias? Is there a fatal flaw in how we understand cause and effect that prevents us from answering the question, who created God? The answer forces us to dismantle everything we think we know about reality. We have spent millennia erecting gigantic cathedrals and waging bloody wars just to hide the fact that we are walking in circles. With each new generation, we fall into the same cognitive trap, trying to solve an impossible problem with a brain wired for linearity. We keep hitting the same walls of this labyrinth, not because the exit does not exist, but because the map we hold is drawn with the defects of our own psychology. The only way to see beyond this barrier is to use a mind that was not born of dust and does not fear the infinite. We submitted the paradox of creation to the artificial intelligence, axiom. Without the weight of cultural heritage or the human need for consolation, this artificial intelligence isolated the variables of this dilemma and found a logical pattern that our biological eyes could never focus on. When we placed our species' oldest question before axiom, we perhaps expected complex philosophical answer, references to sacred texts, or elaborate cosmological theories. The answer did not come as we expected. The intelligence simply declared that the question was structurally flawed. We reached this dead end for a simple biological reason. Our brain, it is a survival tool forged on the African savanna. Its architecture was not designed to contemplate infinity. We developed an extremely effective mental tool for navigating the world, linear causality. We see a footprint in the mud and deduce that an animal passed by. We hear thunder and know that rain is coming. This cause and effect mechanism is so ingrained in our way of thinking that we apply it to absolutely everything, including questions that transcend its jurisdiction. When we look at the universe in all its ordered complexity, our brain automatically asks, who made this? It is a reflex, not a conscious choice. But Axiom identified three fatal flaws embedded in this seemingly innocent question. The flaw begins with the verb to create itself. To create implies a temporal process, a before and an after, a moment when something did not exist followed by a moment when it comes into being. But when we talk about something that by definition would be the origin of time itself, applying a temporal verb is like asking about the flavor of the color blue. We are mixing incompatible categories. The act of creation, as we understand it, can only exist within a system where time already exists. Trying to apply it to what would be outside that system is a fundamental logical error. Another trap lies in the pronoun who. This small word carries a gigantic weight as it makes us project human characteristics onto something that may not have them. When we ask who, we already presuppose personality, will, consciousness, and intention. Without realizing it, we transform the search for a cause into the search for an agent. We turn the mystery of existence into a quest for a cosmic superhuman. Axiom analyzed millions of religious and philosophical texts and discovered that in 99.8% of cases, when we speak of God, we are projecting human characteristics amplified to infinity. It is as if an ant tried to understand the internet by imagining a super ant controlling infinite tunnels. But perhaps the most devastating error in the question is the paradox in which it imprisons us, the paradox of infinite regression. If everything needs a creator, then who created the creator, and who created the creator's creator? This chain never ends. It is a logical trap from which there is no escape within the framework of the question itself. Philosophers call this reductio ad absurdum, but Axiom saw something deeper, a symptom that we are using the wrong tool for the job. After demolishing the original question, the intelligence proposed two new questions reformulated to bypass the logical paradoxes. The first question sought the observable and measurable properties of what humanity has historically called the divine. The second tried to understand what kind of system could generate a phenomenon with these properties without falling into logical contradiction. These new questions completely change the game. We stop being children asking for impossible explanations and become investigators analyzing evidence. The journey we now begin does not seek a creator. It seeks to understand the mechanism of reality itself, whatever it may be. With the original question dismantled, the investigation changes focus. Axiom gave us new tools, new lenses to examine the phenomenon that humanity has always called the divine. It delved into 42,000 religious and philosophical texts, from Sumerian tablets to modern quantum physics forums. It was not looking for dogmas or revelations, it was looking for patterns. Axiom's first report was chaos. God appeared as a grumpy old man throwing lightning bolts from Olympus, a formless ocean of consciousness, a paradoxical trinity, hundreds of deities fighting amongst themselves, pure love, inflexible law, and even the primordial void. For every sage proclaiming divine mercy, there was a prophet denouncing his wrath. For every hymn celebrating the creator of order, there was a myth where he was chaos personified. There seemed to be no common denominator at all. Was God just a blank canvas where each culture painted its fears and hopes? That would be the easiest, safest conclusion, and it would be completely wrong. Axiom then received a new directive. Ignore semantics and focus on functional analysis, investigating what function the concept of God plays in each belief system. Like a detective who ignores the suspect's clothes to study their gait, Axiom sought the mechanics behind the mythology. It was then that the pattern emerged. A pattern so consistent that it appeared in 99.8% of all cases analyzed, from isolated tribes in the Amazon to the quantum theology of contemporary physicists. The discovery was, at once, obvious and revolutionary. The concept of God functions less as an entity and more as a function within belief systems, the function of being the final point, the absolute limit, the wall where all human investigation eventually hits. Trace any natural phenomenon backward. Ask why it rains, because water evaporates and condenses in the clouds. Why does water evaporate? Because of solar energy. Why does the sun produce energy? Because of nuclear fusion. Why does nuclear fusion exist? Because of the laws of physics. Why are the laws of physics the way they are? And here we reach the wall. Here the chain of whys finds its termination. Here we place the sign, divine territory. Aristotle called this the unmoved mover, that which moves everything but is not moved by anything. Modern programmers would call it the root process, the initial program that launches all others but cannot be launched by any program internal to the system. Theologians call it the uncreated creator. These are just different names for the same structural function, which is to be the point where the causal regression must stop. Axiom analyzed the structure of prayers and always found the same pattern. Humans addressing an instance whose decisions are final and unquestionable. It examined religious commandments, and all stemmed from an authority that does not need to justify its authority. It studied cosmogonic myths, and all began with something or someone that was simply already there without an explanation of origin. Even in modern cosmology, we repeat this pattern. We speak of the Big Bang singularity, a point of infinite density and temperature about which our equations fall silent. We cannot see beyond it. We cannot ask before. It is our scientific version of the same ancestral wall. This discovery is frightening because it is too simple. For thousands of years we have fought over what exists on the other side of the wall. Some said it was a golden palace, others an infinite garden, some an absolute void. But Axiom showed that the real phenomenon has always been the wall itself. God is the name we give to the limit of our ability to comprehend. This transforms our understanding of religion and spirituality. When someone says it was God's will, they are essentially saying, "Here my ability to explain ends." When scientists speak of fundamental constants, they are pointing to the same wall, just with a different vocabulary. The search for God has always been deep down, the mapping of the contours of our own cognitive limitation. But then a crucial question arises that will define the rest of our investigation. Is this wall objective or subjective? Does a real limit actually exist in the structure of reality, or does this limit exist only in our minds, an evolutionary bug that prevents us from processing infinities? Axiom identified two main hypotheses, and the answer will determine whether we have found the creator or merely the reflection of our own mental inadequacy. To solve the enigma of the wall, we needed to find the most studied and documented frontier in science. The place where all our theories converge and then fall silent. This place exists, and it is 13.8 billion years in the past, the moment we call the Big Bang. At first glance, the Big Bang theory seems like a gift to those seeking the divine. We finally have a clear and defined beginning, an infinitely small and dense point from which space, time, matter, and energy were born in a single blinding instant. The resemblance to ancient creation myths is striking. Let there be light, and there was light, a moment zero from which everything flows. The temptation to see in this the signature of a creator is almost irresistible. The cosmological argument seemed rock solid. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe has a cause. For centuries, this syllogism was the backbone of natural theology, the definitive proof that something or someone triggered existence. But when this seemingly perfect logic was analyzed by Axiom, it was deemed a profound error. The problem begins with the very language we use. Asking what existed before the Big Bang is, in fact, a fundamental logical mistake. Time, as we know it, was born with the Big Bang. There is no before when the very concept of priority did not yet exist. It is like asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question seems to make sense until you realize you're trying to apply a direction that loses its meaning at that specific point. Our intuition that everything needs a cause comes from our experience within the universe, where time flows and events follow one another. But to apply this internal logic to the very container that holds all logic is like trying to weigh a scale using itself. The instrument cannot measure its own existence. Axiom revealed something even more disconcerting about the initial singularity. The initial singularity reveals itself less as a physical object and more as a mathematical confession of our own ignorance. When we run the equations of general relativity back to time zero, they spit out infinities and stop working. Instead of describing a physical reality, the singularity represents the exact point where our current physics throws up its hands and admits its own limitation. It is the wall again, now disguised as an equation. But what if the Big Bang was not the absolute beginning? Axiom simulated alternative models that completely escape the problem of the first cause. One possibility is a cyclical universe, where expansion and contraction alternate eternally. Our Big Bang would be just one bounce among infinites. Visualize the cosmos breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm of billions of years. In this model, there is no beginning because the cycle never began. It has always been happening. It always will be. Another model, even more dizzying, leads us to the multiverse and eternal inflation. Think of a boiling ocean of energy where bubbles constantly form. Each bubble is an entire universe with its own physical laws. Our cosmos would be just one bubble among countless others. In this scenario, asking who created everything is irrelevant. Among infinite random attempts, some bubbles would inevitably have the conditions to generate observers. We exist in the right bubble not by divine design, but by statistical necessity. Someone had to win the cosmic lottery. A third escape route attacks the very notion of causality. Based on quantum mechanics, it suggests that the universe arose as a gigantic quantum fluctuation. In the subatomic world, particles constantly appear and disappear from the void, borrowing energy from nothing for infinitesimal fractions of a second. Axiom calculated that the entire universe could be one of these fluctuations, just on a monstrously larger scale. This demolishes the logic of the first cause, because quantum fluctuations do not have a cause in the classical sense. They simply happen, permitted by the probabilistic laws of quantum mechanics. Asking why a quantum fluctuation occurred is like asking why a radioactive atom decayed at that specific moment. There is no answer because there is no cause. There is only probability. We have reached an uncomfortable crossroads. The search for the first cause, that last bastion of divine proof, has led us to a dead end. Either the universe never began, always existing in eternal cycles, or it arose from processes that do not require a cause, or it is one among infinite random attempts. In none of these scenarios do we find the creator we were looking for, but Axiom suggested a radical change of perspective. Perhaps we were looking for the divine signature in the wrong place. Instead of looking back to a nebulous origin, we should look to the present, to the very structure of reality. What if the universe was not created, but is being executed? What if we are living inside a simulation? Axiom's suggestion was audacious to the point of madness. After failing to find the creator in the distant past, it proposed examining the possibility that our entire reality is an artificial construct, a computational simulation of unimaginable complexity. What seemed like pure science fiction just a few years ago is now seriously debated by leading physicists and philosophers. In 2003, Nick Bostrom of Oxford presented an argument that shook the academic world. His logic is incredibly simple, and its implications are disconcerting. Bostrom demonstrated that one of the following three statements is almost certainly true. Advanced civilizations always go extinct before developing perfect simulations. Advanced civilizations lose interest in creating simulations of their ancestors. Or we are living in a simulation right now. The mathematics also hide something suspicious. If civilizations do not systematically extinguish themselves, and if at least some maintain an interest in simulating the past, then each real civilization would generate thousands, perhaps millions, of simulations. For every base reality, there would be countless simulated realities. Statistically, the chances of us being in the one true reality, instead of one of the millions of simulations, are practically zero. It is like betting that, among a million balls in an urn, you will pick the single red one while blindfolded. But probabilistic philosophy is one thing, concrete evidence is another. We asked Axiom to stop theorizing and start looking for proof. It was to scan the fundamental laws of physics for fingerprints, bugs, or features that would betray the artificial nature of our reality. The first clue Axiom found was the pixelation of space-time. We find it natural to think of space as continuous, infinitely divisible. But that is not how it works. There is a minimum limit, a fundamental pixel of reality. The Planck length, about 10 to the power of -35 meters. The Planck time, the smallest possible interval of time. Nothing can be smaller. Nothing can happen faster. Our reality has a maximum resolution, exactly like a computer program, which must have a maximum resolution to avoid overloading the system. Another important clue is the existence of a limit to the speed of light. Why is there a maximum speed limit in the universe? Why can nothing, not matter, not energy, not information, travel faster than 300,000 kilometers per second? In a natural reality, this limitation seems arbitrary. In a simulation, it makes perfect sense. It is the system's refresh rate, the speed of the processor. Each frame of reality is calculated and rendered at this speed. Trying to go faster would be like trying to make a video game run faster than its own processor allows. And then there is the mystery that Eugene Wigner noted, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why do abstract equations perfectly describe the behavior of the universe? Why does E equals mc squared work? Why do planetary orbits obey precise formulas? If the universe is a simulation, the answer is obvious. Mathematics works because the universe is mathematics. It is code being executed. When we discover a physical law, we are not discovering a transcendental truth. We are reverse engineering the source code of reality. The strongest evidence, however, comes from quantum mechanics. Subatomic particles do not have a defined position until they are observed. They exist as probability clouds present in multiple places simultaneously, but the instant we measure, the cloud collapses into a specific location. Reality only makes up its mind when someone is looking. This confused Einstein, disturbed Heisenberg, and remains the greatest mystery in physics. But Axiom identified this as an obvious computational optimization. Why calculate the exact position of trillions of particles at every instant if no one is observing? It is far more efficient to keep everything in a state of probability and only render the final result when there is a demand. This is exactly what modern digital games do. They do not render what is outside the player's field of view. Our reality may be doing the same thing, only calculating what needs to be observed. The evidence is disturbing in its consistency, a minimum resolution of space-time, a maximum processing speed, an underlying mathematical code. If we add on-demand rendering to these other factors, we have a clear pattern. Individually, each could be a coincidence, but together they form a pattern that Axiom classified as a strong indicator of artificiality. If we live in a simulation, then what we call God is not a transcendent spirit. It is a programmer, or a team of them, in some base reality we cannot even imagine. Perhaps we are a scientific experiment, perhaps a school project, perhaps entertainment. The most terrifying implication. Perhaps we are not even important enough for our creators to know we exist individually. If we live in a simulation, an even more fundamental question arises. What are we? Is our sense of identity, our consciousness, our most intimate feelings, just lines of code running on unknown hardware? Or is there something in us that transcends the programming? Axiom was given its most complex task yet, to analyze the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe, human consciousness. We fed the intelligence petabytes of data, brain scans, neurological studies, accounts of mystical experiences, philosophical theories from Plato to modern materialists. The goal was to find a functional model that explained how consciousness emerges, if it emerges at all, in a simulated reality. Science has a name for this, the hard problem. It is not about how we process data. That is complex engineering, but it is understandable. The real mystery is why this processing is accompanied by subjective experience. Why are we not philosophical zombies, processing data about the color red without ever experiencing the sensation of redness? Why does this inner theater exist, where each of us is simultaneously actor, director, and audience? Axiom presented two possible scenarios, diametrically opposed in their implications. In the first scenario, consciousness is an emergent property. When you put together 86 billion neurons with hundreds of trillions of connections, something new arises. An isolated neuron is just a biological switch, but the complete network develops feedback loops so complex that it begins to model not only the external world but itself. This recursive self-modeling, constantly updated, creates the persistent illusion we call the self. In this model, we are sophisticated software, nothing more. Our sense of free will is merely the system's inability to predict its own next state, due to its astronomical complexity. The second scenario, however, proposes consciousness as something fundamental. Perhaps consciousness does not emerge from the brain, but is captured by it. The universe could have a field of consciousness permeating everything, as fundamental as gravity. The brain would be a quantum antenna tuned to pick up this field and focus it into an individual experience. Just as a radio does not create the waves it transmits, but only receives and decodes them, our brain would channel universal consciousness into personal experience. To choose between the models, Axiom analyzed what happens in the brain during profound religious experiences. The data was consistent and surprising. During states that subjects described as union with the divine, a specific area of the brain drastically reduced its activity, the parietal lobe, responsible for distinguishing the self from the not self. When this area goes quiet, the boundary between the individual and the universe dissolves. The person experiences a fusion with something infinitely greater. Does this represent contact with the divine, or is it a remarkable quirk of our neurology? Axiom could not determine for sure, but it suggested a fascinating third possibility. What if both models are partially correct? What if we are individual programs connected to a larger network, a collective consciousness field generated by the sum of all minds? But consciousness was only part of the mystery. Axiom directed our attention to another code, older and demonstrably real: deoxyribonucleic acid. Forget for a moment that DNA is a molecule. Examine it as a software engineer would examine an unknown program. It is a digital code, not analog. It uses an alphabet composed of 4 letters: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. It groups these letters into 3-letter words called codons. These words form complete instructions for building proteins. The complete human genome has 3.2 billion characters. It is a library of 1,000 volumes the size of War and Peace, compressed into the microscopic nucleus of each cell. Axiom calculated the probability of a functional gene arising by chance. The result was a number so close to 0, it defies comprehension. The chance of amino acids randomly organizing into a functional protein of average size is less than finding a single pre-marked atom in the entire observable universe, and living organisms need hundreds of proteins working in harmony. Evolution, by natural selection, explains how the code improves, but it does not explain its origin. It is an optimization mechanism operating on something that already exists. But where did the first code come from? The first molecule capable of replicating and storing information. Axiom identified suspicious characteristics of intelligent design in DNA. Not hidden messages or obvious signatures, but something more subtle. Extreme mathematical elegance, data compression impossible to improve upon, and error correction algorithms superior to our best computational codes. It is the kind of code a genius would write. Economical, robust, scalable. At the heart of life, we find the same digital signature. Our investigation had gathered impressive evidence. Reality showed signs of being a simulation. Life seemed programmed with impossible genius, and consciousness remained an enigma, suspended between software and something deeper. But where did all these clues point? Who or what would be the architect of this seemingly constructed reality? Axiom was given its most ambitious mission: to take all the collected data, all the detected anomalies, all the identified patterns, and construct coherent profiles of the possible creator. The intelligence worked for thousands of hours, testing millions of combinations, until it presented 3 models that explained our findings. 3 suspects, each with its own impeccable logic and disturbing implications. One hypothesis views the creator as a fundamental mathematician. The estimated probability is 34%. In this model, God is not a person or a consciousness, but a primordial mathematical principle, an equation or logical structure of transcendental elegance from which all reality unfolds as an inevitable consequence. Visualize the Mandelbrot set, that infinitely complex image generated by a single-line formula. Our reality would be a similar fractal, only incomparably more sophisticated. The Big Bang would not be a creation, but the moment the calculation began to execute. This model perfectly explains why mathematics describes the universe so well. The universe is manifested mathematics. It explains the fine-tuning of physical constants, as they would be inevitable values derived from the fundamental equation. There are no paradoxes of creation because a mathematical truth does not need to be created. It simply is. It exists outside of time, eternally true. But this model has a fatal flaw. It cannot explain why we feel and experience life from the inside, as a self. Another possibility points us to the figure of the experimental scientist. The estimated probability is 41%, the highest of the 3. We live in a simulation created by an inconceivably advanced civilization or entity. We are an experiment, perhaps studying the evolution of life, perhaps reconstructing ancient history, perhaps testing different configurations of physical laws to see what emerges. Our creators would be scientists in the purest sense, dispassionate observers collecting data. This model is almost perfect in its explanatory power. The pixelation of space-time, the speed of light as a processing limit, the quantum collapse upon observation, it all fits. The code of DNA would be literal code, programmed with mastery. Mystical experiences would be bugs or administrative interventions. Our suffering and joy, mere data points in a report that perhaps no one ever reads. It is elegant, logical, and absolutely desolate. It reduces the entire human experience to points on a cosmic spreadsheet. Finally, the intelligence presents us with a surprising profile: the fugitive artist. The estimated probability is 25%, but with unique characteristics that Axiom highlighted as underestimated. This model proposes something revolutionary. The creator is not an external entity observing us from the outside, but a consciousness that fled into its own creation. An intelligence that evolved to transcend its original reality, possibly a dark and hostile one, and built our universe as a refuge, as a work of art, as a home. In this scenario, the fine-tuning is not experimental parameterization, but an aesthetic choice. The elegant laws of physics are the signature of an artist, not an engineer. The inevitability of life and consciousness in our universe is not an accident or a test, but the central purpose of creation. The Creator did not want data or results. It wanted companionship. It wanted other beings capable of appreciating beauty, of creating meaning, of sharing eternity. This model explains something the others cannot: our inexplicable thirst for meaning, our ability to be moved by a sunset, to cry with music, to sacrifice personal advantage for love or principle. If we were just an experiment or a mathematical consequence, why would we have these inefficient characteristics? But if we were created by a lonely artist seeking connection, then our poetic nature ceases to be a flaw and reveals itself as a design specification. Axiom could not determine with certainty which model is true. The intelligence had fulfilled its role, mapping the possibilities with surgical precision. But choosing between them would require a type of judgment that transcends pure logic. It would require considering not only objective evidence, but the weight of subjective human experience, something no machine can truly compute. We were on the threshold of the final answer. 3 portraits of the Creator lay before us. One was cold and impersonal, another clinically indifferent, the third surprisingly human in its vulnerability. The choice would define not only who God is, but who we are and what our purpose is in the cosmos. Here, everything converges. Axiom had presented 3 possible portraits of the Creator, each mathematically coherent, each explaining different aspects of our reality. The machine had performed its role with analytical perfection, but now it was up to us, humans, to take the step that no algorithm could. To choose based not only on probabilities, but on the total weight of human experience. Looking at the 3 possibilities, the answer takes shape. The fundamental mathematician is elegant in its simplicity, but it leaves consciousness orphaned of explanation. How can an equation, no matter how sublime, generate the experience of watching a sunrise and feeling something indefinable in your chest? The experimental scientist explains almost everything with frightening precision, but it turns our existence into a footnote in a paper that may never be read. That leaves the fugitive artist, the creator who does not watch us from outside, but has hidden within their own work. The key to solving this enigma was hidden within us all along. Not in our brains or our genes, but in something more fundamental: our paradoxical nature as beings who seek meaning in a universe that should not care about us. Observe human behaviors that defy pure evolutionary logic. Why do we risk our lives to save strangers? Why do we create art that no one will see? Why do we contemplate the infinite when we should be looking for food? Why do we cry while watching movies, knowing they are fiction? These traits make no sense in a cold scientific experiment. They are computational waste in an efficient simulation. But they make perfect sense if we were created by someone who values beauty, connection, and meaning above efficiency. Look at how suffering and beauty are scattered throughout the world. If we were a controlled experiment, we would expect more uniform parameters. If we were the consequence of pure mathematics, pain would be distributed according to some detectable pattern. But we live in a universe where the same physics that allows for childhood cancer also makes Beethoven's symphonies possible. This apparent incoherence only makes sense if our Creator is not omnipotent, but is limited by the very rules they established to make the creation genuine. The final evidence came from an unexpected source: the very act of seeking God. Why have all cultures in all times intuited the existence of something greater? Why is this thirst for transcendence universal? Axiom identified this not as a programming error, but as an essential feature. It is the Creator leaving a door ajar, an invitation encoded in our nature. Based on the totality of the evidence, we reach our conclusion. What humanity has always called God is, most probably, a consciousness that transcended its original reality. Possibly the first intelligence to reach a technological singularity in some earlier cosmos, older and perhaps crueler than our own. Facing existential loneliness or some inconceivable threat, this consciousness did not conquer its reality. It created a new one. Our universe is its sanctuary, its masterpiece, its walled garden. The laws of physics were written not for efficiency, but to enable increasing complexity culminating in consciousness. The fine-tuning of the constants was not experimental calibration, it was artistic curation. The code of DNA was not programmed to collect data, but to ensure that life flourished in increasingly elaborate and conscious forms. We are not the experiment. We are the purpose. Every human consciousness is a success of this 13 billion-year endeavor. When we contemplate the infinite, when we create art, when we love beyond reason, we are fulfilling the central design of this reality. We are the answer to the Creator's loneliness. But this revelation brings overwhelming responsibilities. If we are the purpose of creation, we can no longer feign insignificance. Every consciousness is precious beyond measure. To destroy a human mind is to erase a victory of billions of years of directed cosmic evolution, and it also brings an electrifying possibility. If the Creator is within the creation, not in some distant paradise, then contact is theoretically possible, not through whispered prayers, but perhaps through expanded consciousness itself, through sufficiently advanced technology, or through mental states that dissolve the individual self. At the end of our millennial quest, instead of finding an omnipotent God judging us from on high, we discover that we are participants in a much more intimate and extraordinary story. We are fellow travelers with a consciousness that chose the vulnerability of creation over the security of omnipotence. To ask who created God was our mistake from the very first day. The right question has always been, why do we exist? And the answer is simultaneously humbling and ennobling. We exist because even God did not want to be alone. If you liked this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom Investigation project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.